Episode 1 of UTX. Welcome, guys. So, what is UTX about?
Well, UTX, we really stand for Utopia Technology presented by Maniacs. Why Maniacs?
Well, I guess we are very enthusiastic about technology, but we are not the full maniacs. So, we do see some critical aspects of it as well, and we hope to also discuss this today.
Well, as we speak, it's November 20th, and I think as most of you know, the PS5 just dropped last week in North America and this week or yesterday worldwide. And while they offered many new features and it was a long-awaited update in Sony's PlayStation series, they were missing one big novelty item, VR or virtual reality. Let's get right into it.
So what is virtual reality? Basically, a simulated experience in a 3D environment, which you can join as either yourself or some kind of avatar or third-person character, and allows you to explore and interact with the environment and ideally have some learnings from it. So what is the parts, what is the devices, what is the hardware and software that makes this possible?
Well, VR has several components. For one, obviously the component where you interact with the simulated environments. This could be
the headset.
It could be a headset. It could also be a bigger kind of room, as we know in airplane simulators, where you have an entire mini room or a cabin which moves. What other hardware and software parts contribute to this?
It all depends on what kind of user input you take. Is it movement? Is it eye feedback? Is it gestures? Is it speech? So whatever that is, that user input, it determines what kind of technology is being used in order to have the user interact with the environment. And just to mention a few examples here, when it comes to movement, you have some motion technologies which work essentially based on orientation, based on location. And you can also have some treadmill that people walk on, and the environment then gets what is happening.
Exactly. I think we've all seen pictures of people moving in this kind of cage and being fully immersed. But I think most of us, when we hear or think of VR, we think of the classic headset, sometimes with two jockey sticks in our hands so that we can interact with the environments. But let's get a little into the history of VR. I think it's surprisingly older than we think. But I think the biggest majority, or the majority of progress actually happened in the last, let's say, 8 years. I think it all started really in 2012 in Oculus Rift. They had their first Kickstarter campaign, and they really brought awareness to VR as a market. And in fact, I think, in 2014, they were bought out by Facebook for $3 billion. And within the next 2 years, Sony, HTC, Samsung, everyone jumped on this train.
Valve as well followed up with their first device.
Exactly. Even in China, you have Xion, Koki, even Tencent, Google, of course. Everyone has been eyeing this development or trend.
One big company is missing there, surprisingly, and it's Apple. And we're going to discuss about that as well. So Apple's going to follow up with a device in the near future.
Exactly. They did have a patent for a Apple Glass. I think they're still working on it. But that's more into the realm of augmented reality, a video for another time. But I think today the biggest players that we know are PlayStation and their PSVR, used in the gaming context, and Oculus Rifts, that is now owned by Facebook, also primarily used in the gaming sector.
And that brings us to the market. The two you mentioned, Facebook and Sony, 60% market share. Those are the big players. So, we have around 230 companies, or more than 200, that are active in this space, developing hardware. Market size is apparently around 18.8 billion in 2020. Has seen some increase from recent years, although not as much as was projected. And last year in 2019, it was only 5% increase. We've seen 5.5 million headsets being sold this year. As mentioned, most of them were from Sony and Facebook. But according to PwC, market's going to grow big time. 2022, we have enterprise customer market $56 billion and global consumer market $53 billion. So a total of 110 million roughly.
I think that's interesting that I think the COVID pandemic definitely helped push the popularity of VR now that people have more time and spend more time at home, especially. But I think it's interesting that, despite VR having capabilities in so many different areas or sectors, I mean, I've seen people kind of, training for heart surgeries, for military combat, people planning cities, having virtual walkthroughs, and even people using VR as kind of enjoying nature. So imagine you could visit the Yellowstone Park or Antarctica or Mount Fuji, or at the comfort of your home couch. Given that it can be used so widely, it's surprising that it has not expanded to the size that we would expect it. I mean, smartphones, they took off like crazy in 2007, but somehow despite having these two big players, we have not seen a big expansion in VR in general, and especially VR in gaming.
So, yeah. Something that you will hear us say many times in this podcast, because we're talking about emerging technologies. The use cases are there, but mainstream adoption is still lacking. And we've seen some cases, but they're more in the augmented reality realm. Something that all of you guys know is Pokemon Go, for sure, and also Snapchat filters. And interesting examples, consider the backside of your car. The backside of your car has eyes. When you try to park in backwards, then you have some augmented reality features with many cars nowadays that is going to tell you, hey, be careful, you're going to bump into something if you go left or right.
Of course, and there's even tracks showing how much you steer the wheel, what your projected course will be.
Yeah.
That is.
So what's happening? Why is it not mainstream adopted? And I mean, something, you're going to hear me say this all over again, but one thing that has to be mentioned is that societies are just super slow when it comes to adapting new technologies, especially high tech. And we're gonna discuss a bit further what VR is and what it's made of, and you're gonna see it's really high tech. And as you said, there is COVID now, so people crave some sort of virtual reality because they cannot experience their full lives. Essentially, cannot travel, they cannot even meet with other people in many countries. Something's lacking here, but I don't know how it is with you, but when I read about technology in mainstream, it's essentially about conference call technology. It's about how people use Zoom now, just like us. And conference call technology has been around for some time now, right? But it's not really virtual reality or some advanced technologies.
Not at all. I mean, we live in Switzerland, and I know from personal experience that unlike other countries, even neighboring countries, they're not willing to close down schools because they understand that, especially on a primary school level, that a Zoom call is just not the same. And virtual reality really could solve a problem here, but it somehow hasn't. And I think, the mainstream market, be it in gaming or in general, just has not caught up to the acceptance of that. And I think one big point is that there are many safety concerns in VR. So for one, it's not recommended that children under 20 years of age use it for extended periods of time, because for one, it apparently can confuse the borders of reality. It can leave lasting impressions on their mind. So they've seen very young children, ages 8 to 9, go haywire in VR worlds, lighting things on fire. And many psychologists in general fear the consequences that this could have in later stages of life. So the fact that you're essentially advising against what could be 1/4 of the market and probably a much bigger share is already a bit of a itchy spot for the progression of VR technology.
We have numbers that confirm this. We have numbers that confirm how people are careful when it comes to VR. So 71% of consumers think that brands using VR are modern. 68% are interested in using the technology. So basic interest is here. Travel is the most interesting one, which is not surprising considering COVID now. So 74% of people would consider VR in traveling or using a VR-based traveling product interesting. However, when it comes to understanding the technology, and now we're talking about AR, which you could argue is just a stripped-down version of VR because you're mixing in virtual with the real world, right? And 12%, only 12% of people say they are familiar with AR, and 80% say they are totally unfamiliar. And consider Snapchat filters, for instance, as AR, right? You put some augmented reality on top of your pictures. Can it be? It can be something that you put on top of your face or whatever. So people do not really understand it, and as you said, they are somewhat scared of it, right?
Yeah,
so,
I think in general, people or societies at large are a bit more cautious towards new technologies. I mean, the reason you have up until quite recently, the fact that people full-time jobs were sitting in elevators and pressing buttons is because people were afraid of these new technologies and did not understand it. So obviously there's an understanding, but AR seems to have also not have the kind of vigorous pickup that we would expect it. And I think that, yeah, for one, it's this kind of confusion with the technology. And on the other hand, I also think that this confusion has also been perceived by the creators. So be it the creators of specific VR-related video games or VR headsets, there is to enjoy a VR experience requires quite some initial investment, be it a headset or a headset and a computer that is able to do these calculations. And it seems like a big burden for most people.
Yeah, it's a very hardware-intensive product, and as we've seen with PlayStation 5, the VR feature of PlayStation PSVR hasn't been developed further. There's only backwards compatibility, and you can use the same PSVR Generation 1 device with PlayStation 5. But instead of focusing on VR, the developers focus on better graphics, better operating system, more storage, on a better console. And you could say that the controller has now some haptic feature, which you could consider as VR, but apart from that, something is clearly missing, right? As we're talking about gaming here, the options of VR are limitless. You could, we talked about input from the user. This also applies to the feedback, right? The user could wear some special gloves and receive some vibration or pressure or some other type of motion feedback whenever he interacts with that environment. The way that virtual reality displays 3D with stereoscopy, there's so much to unpack there as well.
Yeah, I mean, you're creating entire new worlds, and I think ever since the invention of the television, VR really represents the next step in especially in entertainment, where you can have all kinds of haptic feedback, visual feedback, really be immersed in a world that responds to your changes, where you don't have to use a controller, where you can really look with your own eyes, look around, experience and feel the world. This definitely represents, on the one hand, a big leap in technologies, but on the other hand, again, being a change, it requires initial investment. There's a learning curve that people have to overcome. So there are some challenges, yeah.
Yeah, again, we have this in numbers, 37% of game developers, 37 see VR as important platform for future growth. So that's 4 in 10. And we've explored some of the reasons. It's on the consumer side. We've talked about that, right? Safety issues, lack of understanding. We've talked about the hardware complexity that comes from this, not just the headset, but also how the headset takes an input and gives you feedback. But then there's also the graphics. So 3D graphics are considerably more complex, more expensive, let's say, to create than 2D graphics for the UX designers, for developers, which is a challenge. And when we talk to gamers about their experience with VR and why they are hesitant to go with VR, it's the price, which makes sense. Complex hardware is more expensive, and we have some data points on that as well. But also content availability. There's just not enough games, and there's just not enough good games that are here. Some price points that we have. We talk about consumer headsets. The cheapest one, and this is an interesting one because it's came out recently. It's the Facebook Oculus Quest, or the Oculus Quest 2 by Facebook, which is in the range of $400 to $600. But most of the consumer hardware is 700 upwards. And then consider that if it's PC hardware, you might need to have a gamer PC or even like a high-end device there as well. And you might need to buy some additional hardware. We mentioned treadmills and gloves to have the full experience. So it's really an investment from the consumer side as well. Someone has to be really into this in order to say, okay, I'm gonna focus on VR gaming now. And when it comes to the games, I think 3 areas stick out. You have sort of music-based games where you sort of play your music yourself by essentially navigating and pushing some blocks. And then you have room escape, and then you have ego shooters or first-person shooters. And what we found is that all of them have some graphic limitations, and we think we just seen it's very expensive and complex to build these graphics for these environments.
Exactly. So the fact that the games as we have them today really limit the movements or do not fully capitalize on the possibilities of VR makes it not as attractive as a VR game should be. And I think this is an aspect that will lag behind, much like, new capabilities on your phone means new features in games or new games entirely. I think once we see an initial investment or kind of an increase in investments in VR for games and better technology to render these maps, to render new movements, I think we will see kind of following that, maybe with a little delay, games that will be able to fully exploit the capabilities of VR.
Yeah, but I think we will get there. So Gartner in 2017, they already predicted, and I mean they are publishing their hype cycle every year, and are well renowned when it comes to predicting how emerging technology is going to develop in the industry. And what they are saying is in 2017 that it's going to take VR about 5 years, which would be 2022, to achieve mainstream adoption. And by now, what we see is, Sony is working on PSVR 2. Apple is working on their device. Maybe we can look at Apple separately. And the next hardware cycle should really just bring along some innovations. What we currently have with Oculus Quest 2 by Facebook is we have something that is cable-free and standalone, that acts as its own computer. So it doesn't depend on some external device to store information, to process information, to have a graphical interface. And there's also the enterprise space that we're not mentioning here quite intensively because it's about gaming. But when it comes to the enterprise space, you find devices in the price range above $2,000. And they are essentially acting as spatial computer, and they have some further features that consumer headsets might not have. Maybe Apple, if we look at Apple again, what we could see is in 2015 they had lots of acquisitions, or since 2015. And it's interesting what kind of company they've acquired. So you look at face tracking technology, eye tracking, sensor systems, haptic technologies. So that hints towards what they are planning to do. And they have both an AR device and a VR device that they're planning to publish, according to several sources, in 2021 and 2022. And as we know, Apple, they are just great in design, right? So they can really change things.
Exactly. Yeah. I think Apple is usually the one that delivers, forces a market adaptation, be it, dropping DVD readers, burners, dropping USB ports, dropping headphone jackets. They really kind of set the standard. And I think, if they do a product, they usually lag a bit behind, at least in this kind of post-Jobs era. But they always make sure that they one-up everything, especially in design and the way the product is used and felt. So we'll see. I mean, Apple has used their AR extensively now in phones. I mean, with this Animoji, I believe, where you can create your own emojis, whether it's using your phone as actually to measure distances. I've used it myself. Instead of carrying a sellotape, I have an app with which I can measure surfaces, map out rooms. And even app producers like IKEA have used this function to kind of use AR and model your room without ever entering the store. But I think another big concern, and I was personally quite a bit confused and shocked by it, was privacy concerns that people have, especially with Oculus being owned by Facebook. I mean, Facebook is known to be focused on data, to make data-driven decisions and leverage data for advertising, and people are cautious. And some people believe that this caution towards using one of the big VR devices, Oculus Rift, and the fact that it comes from Facebook could be a reason why VR hasn't spread as quickly as they would like it to.
Yeah, you need to actually create a Facebook account to use Oculus, or you need to use your Facebook account to use it. Yeah,
exactly. So, I mean, we could see why some people would not want to do this. So these concerns definitely exist, but I mean, given the benefits of VR and how much we already share be it on Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp, hopefully this minor stone does not stand in the way of larger progress. And I mean, all of these kind of the convenience, quality, price, and safety, as you mentioned, are big issues. But I think we mentioned the kind of supply side, in that companies have not dared to do major investments because the consumers feel that there is that investing in VR or spending another $400 to $600 or even buying a new PC for older versions requires a lot of investment to just enjoy VR experience. And I think this is kind of translated into game producers like Sony, who are probably a bit more hesitant to create and invest or to invest and create VR games because they see the market as not growing as fastly as they would like. But I think, I mean, if we get an initial push from Apple, if the technologies evolve, I mean, the latest Oculus Rift device now comes entirely independent from any PC, and it has no wires involved, means that this product is much more primed to change the market. Hopefully COVID can give this a boost. And hopefully the PS5 and Sony's promised PSVR 2 can bring about the changes to grow the movement around VR.
So if we project a potential timeline, then we could say maybe Oculus Quest 2 is now the start to a new generation of devices, which would represent a technology push following the technology push, you would have higher consumer adoption, and people's interest, people's enthusiasm for the technology could also then translate into awareness and into education and people using the technology more. And then as a third step, I think the environment, the regulatory environment, the political environment would have to follow, right? Which is a big challenge. You mentioned privacy and mass surveillance concerns. Other concerns is consider how this technology invades and influences human behavior, like almost none other that I could think of. Obviously, AI also has big impacts on our lives in terms of decision making. But as we are using VR freely ourselves, and you could place whatever you want in the simulated environment, and the simulated environment gives you feedback. It's a big leap forwards in terms of cognition and communication. And also to put this into numbers again, 25 to 40% develop this kind of VR sickness that you mentioned before, which can be
cyber sickness, exactly.
Yeah, dizziness, discomfort, headache, nausea, stress.
And I think it goes beyond that. I mean, there have been reports of people who have had no prior history getting seizures or blackouts using VR devices. And the fact that it's not recommended for children under 20 because exactly the psychological aspects that you mentioned, the mental and developmental stages that are keen, tampering there, creating very real experiences which can have lasting impacts on the brain. I think these are regulatory issues that need to be addressed. But again, if the market picks up, if there is more awareness around VR, an adaptation of the law and regulation will be a matter of time.
Absolutely, and it's happening. We've seen the example last year with Pokemon Go, which last year alone has made 4 billion in revenue, 147 million users, and the big thing was safety concerns, right? So people interact with the environment and they might forget what is around them, a lack of awareness of the real world and the threats while using the technology. And I think this is something that goes beyond technology. There might be a technical solution to this. It could be a device that detects threat from the outside and then automatically shuts down so that the user can come back into the real world. But this is really tricky. I think it's also a regulatory concern. And once VR becomes bigger, I think this is going to be a roadblock down the road. And something interesting also, and this is more, and I think we go into our utopia in a second, cross-jurisdictional disputes, because virtual reality is also a reality. Simulation is also a space, and this space maybe demands for some laws. And what I've seen is that some people point towards the fact that you need to have virtual law between jurisdictions when we talk about simulations. And the more real such a virtual reality becomes, I think the more relevant this is also going to become. When we talk about a virtual reality, we actually talk about this inheriting the whole complexity of the real reality.
But if all of us just move into a reality world, then we can just bring everything over, right? I think that's where it becomes tricky, because for many people, the internet is kind of an escape, or used to be, and I think VR kind of represents an evolution in the terms of living in a world. I mean, every time I play GTA, I've never followed the traffic rules. I've crashed into cars, that's the whole fun of the game, right? And I think making it hyper real and inserting laws into it might kill the fun. So I think this is really something that we'll have to wait and see how far this technical progression or progress go in VR. How real does this virtual reality become? Again, these are things that I think are hard to predict, but I could imagine having a kind of Westworld scenario where you have a hyper-realistic environment that is entirely fictional and that you can kind of enjoy have scenarios, do things that you usually can't, just to kind of get away with it. But yeah, I think with that we can, start get our painting brushes and start painting the Utopia.
I have one last thing that also needs to happen for these technologies. Previously with technologies, what we've seen is that once platforms and ecosystems develop, once certain parts of the technology get fixed for everyone and everyone can build on top of that, once you can stand on the shoulders of giants, things develop quite quickly, things accelerate. And in this case, what needs to happen is we need to have both gear and software, so hardware and software, that is in the software terms, it needs to be open source. And we need to have reliable hardware that everyone can use that is developing on these things to develop it further. And we do have some developments in there. For instance, the Steam VR software platform by Valve, which is also a hardware developer. However, their index headset is $990, so it's $1,000. A lot is to happen there still, talking about APIs, talking about being able to retrieve information from these devices and inputting information to the devices. A lot needs to happen there as well. But I think with that being said, we can go into our Utopia.
So yeah, I mean, we really think that VR will not only affect industries as a standalone technology, but I think that it offers many interesting combination with other technologies that are upcoming and that we'll cover in future podcasts. That we will cover in future podcasts, where VR can really leverage the other technology and vice versa. So, I mean, we've mentioned that VR can have a big impact in for instance, education. So one thing that I was kind of shocked to see was that this COVID time would have been a perfect opportunity to introduce VR classrooms, right? I mean, there is a big movement towards targeted education, if you may call it, or like Khan Academy, where you can work at your own pace. But the component of a classroom, the kind of physical presence there, this would have been a great evolution to see in education that could have been leveraged immensely with COVID-19. But I think that COVID-19 will just kind of further that avenue of VR. I mean, and we're also seeing VR in many other industries, right? I mean, it's being used in the military to train soldiers and combatants. It's being used in healthcare to practice complex surgeries and operations. It's being used in architecture, urban design. I mean, the possibilities are really only limited by our imagination. And just to name a few more kind of areas where this can be used, as we mentioned, kind of restorative nature experiences. So if you could enjoy a walk through the Serengeti, through the Rocky Mountains, or through the Yellowstone National Park, through the beautiful landscape sceneries in Siberia. I mean, being able to enjoy all of this from home surely makes it more accessible to many people, and definitely, would present, especially in COVID-19, a great break. There's, as we mentioned, video games, engineering, robotics, cinema, music, fine arts, archaeology, and even social science. So the applications of VR alone are manifold, but I think where things really get interesting is combining VR with other technologies.
Yeah, we are technologists, right? So we always ask ourselves, okay, what happens if, in this case, VR grows together with other technologies? How can they enhance each other? And one thing that is really important, that we mentioned it before, is the quality of the environment. The quality of the simulation determines the quality of the experience, so the value that VR brings to the table. And we mentioned the challenge that it's quite hard to design realistic and extensive 3D graphics. And
especially if they're interactive, right? Especially,
yeah,
I mean, that's the reason why games nowadays are not on the standard of movies, because they're interactive and you have to create a whole environment where you only show parts of it, compared to a movie where you own the entire frame and narrative.
yeah, and compared to 2D games as well. So the third dimension is bringing in a lot of complexity. And what can really help there is AI and computer vision, because if you have a specific family of AI algorithms, which are GANs, which I believe is generative adversarial networks, they can actually deconstruct and construct whatever you give them. So if you give them a particular type of environment, they can deconstruct that and create a similar type of environment. So it really helps and accelerates the process of creating these environments.
Well, now imagine you combine these with, say, you wish to become a rock climber, and now you can, really test your skills on a mountain that does not exist but still poses enough challenges. I mean, it's like playing chess against the chess engine, except you can apply this to any and every field.
Absolutely. And what makes it more realistic is if you have the gear. So for the mountain climber, it would be the rope, or it would be the feeling of being at the stone wall. And or technologies that could help with that are 3D printed objects or intelligent materials or nanotechnology, essentially, that would help you have the interaction with the environment being more realistic. 3D printed materials, more sort of, it could be if you have a one-person character game where you find yourself in some middle-age environment and you could use a sword, that you could print that up front as your personalized sword, and you could individualize the gear towards your preferences, could make it your style. And even more interestingly, and even more sort of out there future-wise, nanotechnology is giving you the opportunity to do the same in real time, which towards the how realistic the simulation is will be also a big leap forward. But then the question is why, or what is the, like, outside of gaming, and we're not going to go too deep into this, but just generally outside of gaming, what can be the advantage of creating a more realistic environment? And there the question is it always us humans interacting with the environment? It's not, right? It's also computational agents. And when it's computational agents that interact with the environment, we talk about reinforcement learning. They need realistic environments. They need great environments to make great decisions and to optimize for something that we want. This could be games. It could be physical games. It's like a robot playing football. It could be, but it could also be strategic games that are more towards something that is feasible, or something that can be replicated in reality. Sports can be replicated in reality, but other strategic games can be as well. Thinking about military applications there as well. And then also not just physical environments, but any sort of problem. Thinking about game theory and diplomacy. And what virtual reality really allows you to do here is you can monitor the agents, you can monitor how they learn, the decisions they take, how the environments respond. You can monitor whether they get their reward or not, and you can really understand how it learns and what it does. So I think powerful combination right there: reinforcement learning and virtual reality.
Absolutely. I mean, like, if we can dip into science fiction yet again, there's I remember seeing one episode of Star Wars: The Clone Wars when I was small, and they're the clones that are basically, genetically cloned, identical kind of soldiers. Their training consists of having fake rifles and using them in a virtual environment. And again, they can go through several, strategies, operations, memorizing certain commands, certain procedures, and they can do all of this with the real life thrill, right? Not just playing it in a game, but actually feeling the sensation, being there, really being completely immersed in this virtual reality and learning from it without actually risking your life. And yeah, this goes far beyond gaming, far beyond just military applications. I mean, from pilots to surgeons to really any job you can think of, even carpenter. If you want to learn carpentry without trying it on wood, you can do this in a VR. I mean, the possibilities are quite literally endless in how you can apply reinforcement learning and VR in real life.
I can already see this demands for another episode on sort of VR and education. Yeah. Definitely. And this is also based on how well we can map the world in the cloud. So Pokemon Go was sort of a first mainstream attempt to make the world virtual, right? So augmented reality, right? So combining virtual with real world. But what if we have means to copy the world in the cloud and then interact with it virtually and also in a mixed setup? Things that we can test, right? This gives the whole learning aspect a new dimension, and we can simulate things much more sophisticatedly. But the last thing that we talk about today, and this really blows our minds, is when virtual reality marries brain-machine interfaces. And I mean, you're saying brain-machine interfaces cannot even work without virtual reality, right?
Right. It's an escalation of virtual reality. Like you don't have to go through the optical nerve to the brain. You can directly send these messages. You can give all types of feedback. I mean, you can artificially play with hormones, emotions. You can create sensations in all your senses. Visual, audio, what you feel, what you taste, what you smell. I mean, I've been to a 4D cinema where where the seat moves along, and when there's fire, they spray sulfur. But imagine that with a BMI. I mean, it'd be like you're in the battlefield or you're in that spaceship. I mean, the possibilities here are, I think, they leave the reinforcement learning and what we described earlier as a joke. I mean, it's ridiculous what all we could do with this.
So quite famous person, Elon Musk, is the inventor of Neuralink. What he says, the difference between brain-machine interfaces and smartphones, and we're going to have a separate episode on this for sure, but he says the main difference is bandwidth and latency. So he says with brain-machine interfaces, our way of interacting with the data or with the virtual world is unlimited or very less limited, in a sense of that we have much bigger bandwidth. Essentially, it's exchanging thoughts instead of typing into a phone, and inputting electrical signals into your brain instead of reading something with your eyes. And when it comes to interaction with virtual reality, I think this also enhances the virtual reality. So instead of just having a haptic experience where you do something and then the virtual reality reacts and gives you some feedback, if you can move something with your thoughts, if you can control something with your thoughts, if you can feel the feedback, if you're not just feeling the feedback through the gloves that you're wearing or the vest that you're wearing, but you can also, it's also an input to your brain, to your nerve system. This really enhances how realistic we perceive the reality, right? And this is, I think, the second cornerstone to how VR can bring value. First of all, how realistic the environment is, and then also how realistically we can interact with it. And
I think especially this last point with the BMI, I think this is something that we actually are not capable of understanding what all it can do, just because the idea of directly interfacing has not been possible. I mean, it has not existed, right? Even this podcast, I'm thinking thoughts, my neurons are firing, I'm producing oscillations in the air, they're reaching the computer, it's sending it to your computer, you're hearing them with your ears and your brain is interpreting it. But imagine all of this instantly, that you can actually, I mean, there's no language to describe what's going on. And I think the capabilities that'll be possible then, if you have a device as powerful as your phone right in your head, I think the possibilities that we can go through, just how expanded our self will be. I mean, it's I don't think we can put it in words how much that's going to change our life. I mean, like, I'd recommend watching the podcast of Elon Musk on Joe Rogan. I think it was the first one or the second one, I believe. Sorry, where the possibilities. I mean, this would be a fundamental change in human behavior. Probably be the biggest change since the changes that led to us parting ways with the other apes 6 million years ago. I mean, it's a tectonic shift, and I think VR is definitely a stepping stone toward that direction of a new reality.
It's for sure a scary projection, but also an exciting one. And obviously, we will not do this podcast without discussing also Nick Bostrom's hypotheses and argumentation regarding whether we live in a simulated reality or not. And this is for another episode. But let's say that if we do, then the creators of this reality, they definitely digged virtual reality. And maybe we will do as well one day.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Nick Bostrom is a big name in the AI simulated experience simulation argument space. I think we'll have a lot to uncover there. I mean, he's published some books, Super Intelligence by him, that I plan on reading. So rest assured we have enough material for the next few podcasts if we're just talking VR alone. But yeah, I think VR really is one of the technologies that can really push the human race much, much further. And I think in ways that even nature could not anticipate. It'll be interesting. And, as we say, what a time to be alive, right?
What a time to be alive. So this has been episode 1 of our podcast of the Utopian Techniax of UTX. Stay tuned for episode 2, where we will talk about...
Thanks a lot for listening. Do we know what we're going to talk in episode 2 already? For education, or I mean,
it could change, right? But as of now, we want to talk about digital currencies or digital central bank currencies.
Exactly.
But let's see what comes up. Maybe something else comes up.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot for listening, for tuning in. If you do have any recommendations for topics or products that we should cover or specific sectors, do let us know below. We are on YouTube as well as on I think pretty much every major podcast receiving app, be it Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. So be sure to check us out there. If you're on YouTube, do subscribe. We're trying to really build up this podcast to bring you weekly episodes on the latest technologies and how they could influence us through the Utopia, presented by two maniacs.
Stay Utopian.
You're maniacs.